9 September 1971, an English musician releases an album, United States of America. The musician is John Lennon, and the first track of this album became then an iconic music, a song full of poetry, of melody, Imagine. Of course, we all enjoy the music, but did we really realize the text? Imagine there is no heaven, only sky above us. It's easy if you try. My point is that it's not easy at all. No, it's not easy. My point is that it is not possible to imagine a world without other worlds. Every civilization throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, has imagined another world, a heaven. Mount Meru, for the Hindus, is the paradise of Brahma. The Greeks, the Romans had the age of the Golden Age, the kingdom of Saturn, and then, of course, comes the biblical faiths, and the Prophet Muhammad was carried up to heaven, to Al-Jannah, the Garden of Paradise. My own research is about a Christian notion, which is very interesting, I think very puzzling, very challenging, is the notion of a heaven on earth, of the Garden of Eden, spoken about in the Bible, the very original dwelling place of the first pair of human beings, which is located on earth because the Bible very clearly mentions trees, rivers, bodies, yet has a divine feature, is really a paradoxical condition. This is how I was attracted to this topic. It is then important, I think, to emphasize that I'm not talking about heaven, I'm not talking about the paradise which would be coming after life. I'm talking about the Garden of Eden on earth, a garden situated somewhere on earth. It is where Adam and Eve stayed for a short time, but then they were expelled, as we know from the biblical account, and then now the garden is empty. This is what in the Middle Ages they believed. It is interesting then to explain the career of this fascinating term, paradise. This term had an amazing career because this career started, I think, around the second millennium before Christ, because we know from very scarce material that this word paridaesa was on the lips of a very ancient tribe living in Iran, the Medes, and we know that around the 8th century paridaesa was used by Persian, in the Persian Empire, to indicate these beautiful royal parks where the princes of the Persian Empire would enjoy hunting. And then the words had a kind of, really, as I said, a career, an adventure, because the very first turning point was when the Greek historian Xenophon in the 4th century translated this word paridaesa, which in ancient Persian meant a secluded place, a place surrounded by a clay wall. He translated that when he talked about and wrote about Persia, that he knew very well, with the Greek paradeisos. Then in the 3rd century, the famous 70 scholars who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, when they read in Hebrew, in the book of Genesis, the reference to Gan Eden, they translated Gan Eden into paradeisos. So they used the Greek word coming from the Persian terminology. What is fascinating is that later on, around the 2nd century, in Hebrew circles, the word paradeisos, the notion, became to be referred also to another world, the heavenly paradise. Hence the overlapping of the two things. So much so that in the 1st century, when, as we all know, Christ was dying on the cross, and the good thief made the last theft of his life, the best, and then he obtained to go to paradise, he said, today you will be with me in paradise. And definitely he didn't mean the Garden of Eden, but he meant the heavenly paradise. So the confusion, the overlapping goes back to the early times. And this is why I think it's very important that I explain that my research is on the earthly Eden, which, to cut a very long story short, became to be clearly defined only since Augustin, around 400. Saint Augustine was the authority which very clearly distinguished the Garden of Eden, the condition natural and earthly of Adam and Eve, from heaven, from the resurrected bodies the blessed will have at the end of time. So, as we know, the medieval doctrine was very much influenced by Augustine. The idea was that humankind would progress from the Garden of Eden, from which they were expelled, through history up to the heavenly paradise. My interest is in this very Western Latin notion that developed from Augustine's reading of Genesis. For Augustine, it was very important to defend the literal authority of Scripture. It was very important to defend the goodness of material life against heretics and Gnostic, Neoplatonic tendencies to see the lower world of materiality as impure. And for Augustine, it was important to show that the material creation was created by God, it was good. The body is created by God. We are meant to be embodied. And this is for me very important, because many modern, even not only popular thinkers, even scholars, forget what was the intellectual context of Augustine. Other fathers of the Church did not think in these terms. They thought that we had a body and sexuality because of sin. What Augustine's notion implied was that if Adam and Eve had a body, they had to have a place, a material space, and this material space was the Garden of Eden. In one of the earliest Latin translation of the original text, which by the way is no longer extant, the Latin, the Vetus Latina, the old version, says that God planted Paradisum in Oriente, in the East. This is why people began to imagine, like John Lennon, this wonderful heavenly garden located somewhere in the East. But my story is actually based, if I can simplify this, on a single word, a single Hebrew word, which is in the Hebrew text. In the Hebrew version of the book of Genesis, we read that God planted Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, Mikkedem. Mikkedem is a fascinating word. Mikkedem tells us when God planted the Garden of Eden. Mikkedem tells us where God planted the Garden of Eden. This word combines time and space, because it tells us that God planted the Garden of Eden at the beginning, in the sunrise of time, but also that God planted the Garden of Eden in the East, in the sunrise of space. And all the history of mapping paradise that I researched for many years is based upon this combination of time and space. And upon this combination of time and space is based all the map making from the Middle Ages. And my own interest was to show that medieval cartography was not simply a very naive, unscientific, bizarre, superstitious practice. It was scientific, it was science in its own term. I think the 19th century and also 20th century scholarly approach to this topic showed a bit of condescendent smirk, a sort of superiority. We are modern, we know how the world looked like, we know that these people were wrong, and we know that there was a progress. Then we made discovery, our technology is better, and we mapped the world much better than they did. They even put monsters, marvels, religious stuff. No, this is not science. I hope to have shown that this is not true, and I think it's important to learn a lesson of humility. Our culture, our science, our technology is just different. It's not necessarily better than theirs. So my point was to look at the medieval cartography to understand the mapping of paradise, which was not just the mapping of a fantasy place, but it was an inclusion of the temporal dimension. Medieval maps are historical chronicle, showing us the events where they took place. And there is a vision of mankind's history going from the Far East, from the Garden of Eden, moving westwards, centering in Jerusalem, where the peak event of human history took place, the Passion of Christ, and then finally from the early Eastern kingdoms moved to the Mediterranean basin of the Roman Empire, and this was the end in spatial terms, and the end also in temporal dimension. The end was near. This is to say that the mapping of the Garden of Eden was not just an isolated superstitious practice. It was part of a much wider vision of human salvation history. A history that started in the Garden of Eden, which was seen as an intriguing notion of a heaven somewhere located on earth. We can see now, we can appreciate that this medieval notion of a Garden of Eden on earth was not just a fantasy, bizarre, superstitious, ultra-devotional approach, unscientific idea to the representation of the world. The Garden of Eden was part of a wider vision of mankind's salvation history. It was where everything began. I find very interesting to appreciate one aspect of the medieval Weltanschauung, that they conceived of a section of creation still untouched by the corruption of human sin. There was somewhere in the Orient some portion of the earth that was still coming directly from the hands of God. It was still a heaven on earth. It was still before the fall. Nobody knew where it was. Nobody even dared to think that they could approach it in their lifetime. But it was a consoling idea that there was something there. It was also a reminder of the seriousness of human fall and human sin that made such a beautiful reality becoming unapproachable. Later on, this idea will develop in different directions, and it is interesting to see how Renaissance, Reformation and modern thinkers try to say the same thing in completely different terms and in completely different contexts. In a completely different way, paradise was lost because of human sin. In the Middle Ages was distanced in the space. It was in a remote east. For modern thinkers, paradise became lost in time. It was no longer there. You could go there, you could approach the real location, but you wouldn't find the Garden of Eden of Adam and Eve because it was destroyed.